Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you FFF's principled, uncompromising case for libertarianism and the free society. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners once more.
Yep, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org, where you get a monthly article by Richard, you get the weekly Libertarian Angle, and of course 28 years worth of blog posts and articles, conferences, videos, seminars, all presenting this principled case for the free society. Richard, I thought we would discuss sanctions and embargoes, since they form such a core feature of American foreign policy. And of course there's several dimensions we can examine about these things, one of which is the power of the president to impose sanctions and embargoes on any country he wants or any people he wants. I mean, this is quite phenomenal in a country that supposedly prides itself on representative divided government, where you usually have to get a law enacted by Congress and then signed into law by the president. And then it's enforced and, of course, construed by the judiciary for its constitutionality. Not anymore in the United States. The president has the authority to impose sanctions and embargoes anytime he wants. And then there's also the moral aspects of the horrible death and destruction that they wreak, and I think this is probably the biggest objection, the damage and death and destruction that they wreak on innocent people in foreign countries, and it's all for a political purpose. It's for regime change. So the idea is that you squeeze the life or the economic resources out of the citizens of a country in the hopes of achieving a regime change that brings into power a pro-U.S. politician that can be controlled, sort of a puppet type thing by the U.S. national security establishment. And then, of course, there's the third one, which perhaps is just as big, if not bigger, and that is the destruction of the freedom of the American people. That sanctions and embargoes place restrictions on the ability, the freedom of Americans to trade and travel wherever they want. And perhaps the crown jewel of this immoral and destructive system is the embargo in Cuba. That's an embargo that's gone on for more than half a century. The original idea was that, the Cubans were coming to get us. This was during the Cold War. The communists were coming to get us. And we need to have this embargo, the Cubans call it a blockade, that punishes Americans who travel to Cuba and spend money there, or prohibits American businesses from doing business there. And now punishes foreign businesses who do business in Cuba. And it's all with the idea that if you can just impoverish the Cuban people enough, bring enough maybe death by starvation, that they will either oust their communist regime, or there'll be a coup that installs a pro-U.S. general into power, or that the dictator in power, in that case Fidel Castro, will have a crisis of conscience because he'll see all his people dying and suffering, and he'll say, okay, I'll get out, and be replaced by a pro-U.S. dictator. Well, of course, that embargo says it all. I mean, you have massive suffering of the Cuban people, along with their socialist system. I mean, it's sort of like the Cuban people that have been squeezed in a vice, where one side of the vice is their socialism and the other vice is the U.S. government with its embargo. And of course, totally failing to oust the Cuban regime. All it did was magnify the deaths and the sufferings of the Cuban people, and destroy freedom, economic liberty for Americans at home. And you can look all over the world at where this phenomenon is taking place: North Korea, Iran, Russia, China. These sanctions and embargoes have become sort of a willy-nilly approach to U.S. foreign policy. So I would suggest as libertarians that there's only one proper position for any person to take, both morally speaking and economically speaking, and freedom speaking, and that is to lift these embargoes, lift these sanctions, and absolutely prohibit the president and the rest of the government from ever imposing them on any country. What do you think?
Well, I'd like to maybe sort of add an historical dimension to this. You had mentioned the horrendous effect on the innocent bystanders of the citizens of the country that the United States might be embargoing. But it can also lead to wars. If I can use two historical examples, Jacob, in American history. Following the French Revolution in 1797, there occurred almost a quarter of a century of warfare between first revolutionary and then Napoleonic France and many of the major other countries of Europe, most especially Great Britain. And as a result of this, the British and the French respectively decided to impose blockades and embargoes on each other's territories. Napoleon attempted to use the French naval fleet to blockade or embargo the British Isles. In other words, try to limit the resources, raw materials, and war-related supplies to assist Britain from the rest of the world and its own colonies from fighting France in Europe. Reciprocally, the British imposed similar blockades and embargoes against continental Europe, that is, those parts of Europe with coastlines that were under either the control or alliance influence of especially Napoleon's France. This led to war, two wars that the United States fought. One was a less aware war, which occurred in the beginning of the 19th century between the United States and France, because America was neutral. It was a new country, the new nation of the United States of America. And as a neutral, even though we had sympathies, obviously, for the French with their revolution, since the French had supported the Americans in our revolution, we were neutral. But the British and the French each said that they had the right to board American ships and seize what they viewed as contraband, because that was aid and comfort to the respective enemy nation. And there were sea battles between American naval vessels and French naval vessels. But the most significant one of this is that this became the condition or rationale, if you will, for the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain, because the British were boarding American ships and not merely seizing what they were defining as contraband that was, they claimed, heading for French-controlled ports in Europe, but they were seizing American sailors. They were basically conscripting them into the British Navy. If they boarded a ship and they checked, quote, the papers of the crew members, and a crew member could not prove that he was an American citizen, he could be taken off the ship and compelled to serve in the British Navy. And those were among the conditions that led to the War of 1812, which resulted in the British actually landing in Chesapeake Bay, marching up to Washington, D.C., and basically burning down the Capitol building in the White House when James Madison was president. And his wife, he and his wife Dolly Madison, had to get out just before the British arrived. And poor Dolly Madison carrying her big ice cream machine, right? Dolly Madison ice cream, for those who remember.
Good, Richard.
I guess someone would define that as fake news. Anyway.
Don't give up your day job.
Then the other instance, which is also actually not humorous, is that this was what helped precipitate America's entry into the Second World War. The United States had declared Japan to be an aggressor nation for having invaded China in 1937 and have occupied large areas of the Chinese coastland and inland. The United States said that this was unacceptable, and the U.S. began in 1940, especially beginning in the spring and the summer of 1940, embargoing oil supplies and other, what they defined as war-related material, basically scrap metal, from being exported to Japan. At the same time, we, quote, strong-armed the Dutch. Holland had been overrun by the Germans in Europe but Dutch authorities still controlled their East Indies empire. That is what today we call Indonesia. And we basically strong-armed the Dutch not to sell oil from what is now called Indonesia to Japan either. And the Japanese found themselves in a difficult situation. Now, this is not a defense of their invasion of China. From sort of the objective historian's point of view, they were in the wrong. But America had decided to put its nose in two other countries' foreign affairs. And the Japanese found themselves in the situation with dwindling oil supplies of either conceding to American demands, which was basically for them to totally withdraw from China, which, given their mercantilist and imperialist ideology, was not going to fly, or trying to break out of this American blockade and embargo by declaring war on the United States and attempting to seize those areas of Southeast Asia with supplies and material which they viewed as essential for their war effort, including the oil fields in what today we call Indonesia from the Dutch. And therefore, these are two instances that brought about wars that had impacts for the United States. The War of 1812 and the America's entry into the Second World War, with all of its consequences for the American people and for the world. Now, the other element that I would just highlight in this is that the rationale for embargoes, and you were touching upon this, Jacob, is the idea that if you put enough pressure on the government that is being sanctioned in this way, by restricting supplies, trade, investments into that country, the people will feel so negatively impacted, so economically harmed, that they will put pressure on or even rise up and overthrow their own government. This has virtually never happened. All that it has done is basically put pressure on the innocent bystanders who are the victims of their own government, while the government just rearranges the resources of the society, husbands and economizes the resources of society to serve its own purposes. The people are without food. The political leaders in these countries, I can assure you, dine well. The people are limited in the goods and services or the energy supplies with which they can get by on their daily life. I can assure you, these government officials live in homes in which there's electricity and heat on or air conditioning during the summer, and they merely shift resources, the more limited resources, to the extent that the embargo and sanction works, to serve those purposes that the government gives priority to, and not what the ordinary citizen would view as a priority. And then finally, there's unless it is a comprehensive embargo in an integrated world like today, the U.S. can declare an embargo or a sanction, but it doesn't mean other countries will. Now, as you were saying, the United States sometimes bullies other countries. For example, it imposes sanctions on Iran or North Korea, and suddenly anyone in the world who violates America's declaration of a sanction or embargo is to be punished for violating the wishes, desires, and commands of those who rule in Washington. I would just like to see what would happen if Russia or China imposed such a sanctioned embargo on some country with which the United States had an alliance or sympathies. And the Chinese said, we're now going to try to punish Americans or hold Americans legally subject to prosecution for having violated China or Russia sanctions on some country to which the United States was aligned or was sympathetic. There would be an international uproar. How dare the Chinese or the Russians prosecute Americans for doing something that the American government considers legitimate? It would cause an international crisis of huge magnitudes. But because America really is the biggest bully on the block, it can get away with this. It can twist a lot of arms. But all it does, it draws in a global set of innocent bystanders into the purpose that the American government has set for itself to harm, limit, or bring down a foreign government that those in Washington, deem as unacceptable on the global scene, regardless of how much collateral damage in terms of the innocent victims, both within the sanctioned country and all those who are in the sidelines of this battle.
Yeah, your analogy to war is very good, because the way I look at it, Richard, these sanctions really are effectively an act of war. I mean, they're not if it was a total blockade, like a military blockade, it would clearly be an act of war. I mean, you'll recall during the Cuban Missile Crisis when President Kennedy was going, he called it a quarantine. He was going to board Soviet ships, and if they had any kind of nuclear material, he was going to send them back. But everybody got really nervous, and naturally so, because traditionally a blockade is an act of war. One nation does not have the right to stop another nation from shipping whatever it wants to another nation. But Kennedy called it a quarantine, and fortunately, Khrushchev turned the ships around and didn't test the blockade. But a sanction to me is essentially the same thing. Now you're not blockading things. You were, for example, the sanctions were enforced to that extent against Iraq during the 90s when Saddam Hussein was still in power, and they were trying to get him out of power. They had these brutal sanctions, UN and the U.S., against Iraq, and they were very, very effective. I mean, those were enforced militarily, and the Iraqi people went from somewhat lower middle class. They had a fairly prosperous society in the Middle East. They went to absolute total poverty. When people were selling their prized possessions just to have the food to eat, and that was when hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children were being killed. There's that famous line by Madeleine Albright, who was the UN ambassador to the United Nations. I mean, here is the official spokesman for the United States to the world, and 60 Minutes asked her whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children are worth it. And by worth it, they're referring to regime change, trying to get rid of Saddam. And Albright says, well, it's a tough issue, granted, but yeah, it's worth it. I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, what she's saying is that we're targeting these people, including the children, to get rid of Saddam, and therefore the fact that 500,000 Iraqi children have died from malnutrition or infectious illnesses and so forth, hey, yeah, it's worth it. It's unfortunate. I mean, what kind of nation has that kind of mindset? And her boss, President Clinton, he certainly didn't criticize her or condemn her. Neither, as far as I know, did any member of Congress, Republican or Democrat. The mainstream media didn't criticize her. Why? Because she was expressing the official mindset of the federal government in Washington. That, hey, as you put it, the big bully can kill as many children as he wants. As long as he's got an American flag there on his sleeve, those deaths don't matter. The bureaucrat just keeps enforcing the sanctions. It's what Hannah Arendt referred to as the banality of evil, that we're just enforcing these sanctions. And what they do with these things, you can see it with Iran now, they go after businesses that do business with Iran. As you point out, there's this extraterritorial aspect that's incredible. Yes. I mean, it's one thing for the federal government to say, we're going to punish American citizens for violating our rules and regulations because we're trying to get rid of this guy. But now they extend it everywhere, and that's, when they jailed this woman in Canada, here's a woman who is a high executive in this telecommunications thing. I mean, they're like the Apple. Their name is Huawei, and they're like the Apple of China. And she's the executive vice president or something like that. They jail her. And why? Because they say she conspired to secretly do business with Iran. Well, so what if she did? I mean, she's a Chinese citizen. Why shouldn't she be free to engage in business with whomever she wants? But they're going after her. So it's essentially a blockade. Now, the reason the war thing is so good that you bring up is that, as you know, the way the U.S. has always wanted war is they want the other side to attack first. So they can say, oh, we're just defending ourselves. Unfortunately, we've been attacked. It's a day of infamy. We need to now attack this country in self-defense. And so what the idea of the sanctions is, you're tightening a noose around the citizenry. Slowly but surely, you're squeezing the life out of people. And the hope is that the dictator just has this crisis of conscience and gets out, or there's a coup or a revolution. I I mean, that's another thing, is that they'd like to see the citizenry of the country have a violent revolution. It doesn't matter how many people get killed in that revolution, as long as the regime change is being attempted or effected. But there's another thing, is that, you know, the regime may get to a point where they say, you know what, we just got to attack these people. I mean, they're killing our nation, and we're going to strike out. And the U.S. would love that. I mean, they would love, like Iran, to say, you know, enough's enough. We're going to hit them back, because then they could say, oh, we're now going to war with Iran in self-defense. So and that's effectively, as you point out, what the Japanese did. I mean, they were squeezing the lifeblood out of them with this embargo. And finally, the Japanese said, well, okay, let's see if we can knock out the U.S. fleet. And that was what the attack on Pearl Harbor was all about. It was never to come and conquer the United States and take over the federal government, run the public schools and the interstate highway system. That was never in any part of Japanese goals, despite what we're taught in our public schools. Their limited objective was, let's knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet so that we can go into Indonesia, into the East Indies, and get our oil supplies and be able to furnish the oil for our military machine in China. Now, it was a foolhardy mission, and certainly the U.S. seemed to have been prepared for it, because a lot of their ships were not there in Pearl Harbor. They had been taken out. There were some that were left there that almost appears like bait. But the fleet was easily able to reconstitute itself, and of course they'd broken the Japanese military codes. So it seemed like Roosevelt got what he wanted. But the point is the Japanese, in order to break out of this embargo, initiated this act of war that enabled Roosevelt to say, we've been attacked, we're innocent, we had no idea this was going to happen, we're shocked, and that gives him his opportunity to go to war against Japan, as well as what's called the back door to war in Europe, which he had not been able to attain prior to that time, despite his best efforts to provoke the Germans into attacking the U.S. So this thing of sanctions and embargoes really has all kinds of dimensions, but as you point out, this act of war is one of them.
Yeah, let me sort of add also a wider dimension to understanding this. This idea, as you were saying, Madeleine Albright said, well, it's okay to sacrifice implicitly as collateral damage. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Maybe up to 500,000 Iraqi children to bring about regime change. What is the origin of this mindset? And it is all part of the collectivist counter-revolution of the last 100 years. This idea of total war involving a total state emerged out of the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries, once they were fighting the monarchs of other parts of Europe who wanted to basically squish the French Revolution as a threat of radical change, the French revolutionaries said that the nation is everything. You're no longer loyal to a king, you're loyal to the nation, the people, and everything must be sacrificed. Some must give their labor. Others must give their tax money. Some must give their blood in serving in the army because there'll be conscription. Now, this idea that there is no separation between the society and the state, that the state is society and therefore everyone is subject to and a property of and a pawn to be used as the state considers good, was revolted against once Napoleon passed and the arrival of the more or less classical liberal epoch of the mid-19th century. Conscription was ended, governments were limited, militaries were reduced, and there emerged these things in the 19th century of the rules of warfare, that even when a country invaded a neighboring nation, they were to respect the life and the property of the citizens of the occupied country, as long as the people of that country did not act as saboteurs or fifth columnists, if you. And the rules of war were established. Now, did countries follow this? But the spirit was, you don't do this, you don't do that. That would be beyond the pale of civilized nations towards either combatants on the other side or non-combatants that came under their control. All of that was thrown out of the window in the 20th century, Jacob, with our two total wars. The idea of gassing the enemy on the battlefields of France during World War I, then the total war of World War II, where the Nazis on the one hand killed millions of innocent civilians based upon their racist theory of superiority and inferiority, and the Allies basically destroying not only Germany, but many other parts of Europe in the idea that you carpet bomb, you destroy anything out of the way, and to bring about the end of the enemy regime. And even if untold innocent victims are the product of bringing about that result, well, then that's just too bad. You have to bomb French towns and villages under German occupation to maybe hit a railway station. That's too bad. You bombard a coastline and you use artillery and people's private homes and innocent occupants of an occupied country are killed by American shelling. Well, you know, that's the price of war. And so then you're left with these pictures of Germany after the Second World War, the carpet bombing of German cities by day and night, the firebombing of Hamburg. The fire bombs were so intense, Jacob, of Hamburg over a 3-night, day and night attack, that people melted into the asphalts of the streets. They didn't even die from the flames. They died of suffocation as the fireballs sucked all the oxygen out of the air, so they suffocated even before their bodies melted into the asphalts of the streets. Now, you know, everyone say, yeah, but look what they did. Fine. The Nazis killed 6 million Jews. They killed 3 million Poles. They killed 500,000 Gypsies. They maybe probably killed 10 million Russians and Ukrainians, all because these were, quote, subhumans, right? But two wrongs don't make a right, Jacob. And we then, if what was done by the United States and the British government during the Second World War in terms of their carpet bombing and fire bombings were done by any country today, the international community would declare it a war crime. Now, when you lose this sense of separating the civilian from the military, the society from the state, that logically follows that Madeleine Albright says something like, if 500,000 Iraqi children have to be sacrificed to bring about the regime change, well, these Iraqi children are the state over there. They're all part of what's owned by the state, and if they might grow up and become soldiers to fight America or to undertake terrorist attacks or subsidize weapons of mass destruction, which supposedly Saddam Hussein had. So this all follows from the disappearance of the innocent human being, the individual, and the state everything. And since the state is society, then everything in the society is fair game to bring the state down, either in a declared or undeclared war. And that's the world in which we live.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it goes back even to the Civil War, where you've got the U.S. With its Sherman's march through the South, where they were burning homes and fields and stuff, leaving women and children homeless, exposed to the elements, and dying as a result. And it didn't matter, because what mattered was military victory. And it was this mindset of total war that was used even back then. And then, as you point out, in the two world wars, there was, of course, Dresden as well, the total destruction of really a defenseless city. And yes, it's true, the Germans were bombing London and so forth. But as you ask, you know, where's the morality in doing something horrific that the enemy is doing? If the enemy is attacking civilians, does that justify the U.S. doing the same thing? And then you've got the firebombing of Japanese cities, and of course the two atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that mindset is, hey, this is total war. We have to win it. A lot of soldiers are going to die here if we don't kill all these innocent civilians, and therefore it's okay. Well, it's not okay. And it's also not okay to be targeting these innocent civilians in Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Venezuela, wherever. as a way to affect regime change. I mean, look, what's the big objection to terrorism? It's the idea that, hey, the terrorists are targeting innocent people as a means of affecting something, a political end. Well,
yes.
That's what sanctions and embargoes do. And the other really pathetic thing about this, Richard, is how the mainstream media plays into this. I mean, there's like no conscience at all in any of this. Like when the North Korean sanctions are killing more people, they'll refer to it as, oh, the sanctions are starting to bite. Now the North Korean leadership was going to have to buckle in because the sanctions are biting. Well, what do they mean by biting? It means they're killing people or causing massive suffering in people. And there's this exaltation of this success. Oh, isn't this wonderful? The sanctions are starting to bite. And they're also biting in Iran. There's people that have actually died in plane crashes, innocent people. These are civilian airplanes that have died in domestic flights because they can't get the parts to maintain and repair the planes, the domestic planes there. I mean, it is an incredible moral crisis here that people can't see this horrific, immoral conduct of targeting innocent people. And it's really, if there's anything that the American people could really do to get this country back on the right track, morally speaking, it's to stop these sanctions and embargoes against everybody. They're counterproductive, they're negative, they destroy innocent people, and they destroy our freedom. The best thing we could ever do, Richard, is to prohibit this government, the federal government, from ever imposing sanctions and embargoes on anyone again, and of course lift the ones that are out there right now immediately.
At the end of the day, and I totally agree with what you just said, Jacob, but at the end of the day, the only way these types of things will ultimately either happen less frequently or even never happen again is there must be a reawakened philosophy of individualism, that the state does not own society, that the society is made up of individuals who should be viewed as having unalienable rights, as our founding fathers said in the Declaration of Independence, that governments serve to protect the liberty of the citizenry. The citizens are not pawns for the purposes of the state. Because to the extent that you hold that latter view, that individuals are pawns to serve the purposes of the state because the state is the society, then you will have war crimes. You will have mass infliction of harm and damage, including through sanctions and embargoes and trade restrictions imposed upon other countries, regardless of its negative effects on the innocent citizens of that affected country, as well as your own citizens who are prohibited from freely trading and associating with whomever they want. Until that is reawakened, that spirit of liberty separate from the state, and that the state is supposed to exist, government should exist, if it does, merely to secure liberty and not to violate it, unfortunately, the collectivist mentality will bring about these tragic episodes.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you need a freedom revolution, but you also need a moral revolution. That is a conscience revolution. I mean, yesterday, the churches of America are filled with millions of people. It's Easter Sunday, and yet, you know, these people, they start life today on Monday, not even giving a thought to what their government's doing to innocent people. It is impossible to reconcile these sanctions and embargoes with Christian principles. And so what's really needed also, in addition to the freedom revolution, is the revolution of conscience, where people's conscience reigns supreme and says, you know what, I don't want to be part of a nation whose government is doing this. I need to play a role in this. I need to take a stand against this type of thing and continue taking the stand until they finally bring it to a stop. On that note, Richard, we're out of time. Greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
And thank you to our viewers and listeners. As I always try to remember to say, thank you for sharing a little bit of your time with us.
Yeah, thanks for viewing, and thanks for your comments, too, on our program. We really appreciate it, especially the positive ones. And come and see us at fff.org. You get Richard's monthly article, you get Libertarian Angle, and you get my daily blog post, and a lot of other good, principled presentation of libertarianism. Thank you again, and we'll see you next week.